Well, my career in journalism really started in New York City. I went to the journalism school at Columbia, 1981, 82. After getting a bachelor's degree in biology a long time ago, 1978 at Brown University, I was out in the world for a year or two, got a fellowship to to do some projects overseas, and that really opened my eyes to journalism as opposed to pursuing science. At Columbia, the journalism school back then really was newsroom-ish, and it was sort of like it was go out into New York and report the hell out of it and come back with stories. There was this RW1, like reading and writing one, was the core course, and so we dove into the systems of New York City. I remember Laurie Cohen and I going up into the subway yards in the Bronx, where the IRT trains rest at night, and getting to know the culture of the graffiti writers, and then I covered a fire in the and where was it? In a part of Brooklyn that was very, very poor and starkly and dangerous and tough, East New York, I think, and interviewed families dislocated in the fire, and on and on. How does the city work or not work? And it was a great grounding. So you're surrounded by just the best story in the world right now. That I did circle back to my science as the core of my journalism right out of school. Although I did have a diversion where my first job out of journalism school, 1983, was to take a sailboat along the New England coast for 3 months and write and photograph a series of stories. But I dove into science because I thought I had a foot up. Back then, science journalism was booming. The 1980s was sort of the heyday of science magazines. I was at Science Digest. There was Discover and Omni, all kinds of great publications. And I, started interrogating tough questions. My first big feature story was on paraquat, an herbicide weed killer, that my editor had assigned me to do this while I was doing my job. My job was copy editing at this magazine, but the editor luckily was willing to give us time to report and write. And he wanted me to do this story on paraquat because it was in the news because two guys were having lung transplants. And that was a novel operation at that time. Heart and kidney transplants were already established. Lung was not. And it turned out that these two patients, one in Toronto, one somewhere in, I think, Virginia, the reason their lungs had to be replaced, they were dying, was because they'd been exposed to this herbicide. And I started to drift in my reporting from what I had been assigned to do, which is a story on the future of lung transplants, to what the hell's, why are these two guys dying because of this weed killer? And that became the core of the story, and it ended up winning me. It was my first magazine feature, and it won an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, one of the top awards in journalism, because I kind of followed the data rather than following the assignment. So I think there's an important insight there, which is don't get captured by a narrative, whether it's an assignment from an editor or it's a predetermined sense of what a story is in a newsroom. And this applies to everything around you, not just herbicides. But follow the data, follow the question. Like if something's tugging you to the side when you're going in a certain direction, don't ignore that. And just to give you another sort of goofy example of the value of that, 1997, I was sitting on my couch in Brooklyn with my wife at the time, and where was I in 1997? I'm losing track of time. Somewhere in the 90s, somewhere in the world, we were watching MTV News for no particular reason. And it turned out that the band Judas Priest, the heavy metal band, was hiring a new lead singer. It was this kid from Ohio named Tim Owen was going to become the lead singer of Judas Priest. And he came from a tribute band. So why is this relevant to what I was just saying? I could have, it had nothing to do with my work at the time, but it was intriguing. I kept thinking, wow, so a kid from a cover band who worshiped this band now is the leader of the band. And I kept saying that to people. And when I caught myself, if you catch yourself saying, "Did you hear that? ... about something," that's something to dig in on too. And I mentioned it to the arts editor at the New York Times, where I was working at by then. And she said, "Oh, maybe," I said, "maybe I should write a little profile of this guy." And so I filed like a 1,500-word story, and she said, "Write more." That's the only time in my life ever an editor has said, "Write more." And I turned in a 3,000-word piece, and it went on the cover of the Arts and Leisure section, and it ended up being a movie.
Oh, wow.
Rockstar. It came out right around 9/11, so a lot of people didn't see it at the time. It was Mark Wahlberg and Jennifer Aniston. And if I had let that little thread slide by, that wouldn't have happened. So just pay attention to those the things that catch the edge of your consciousness are really something fun. So aside from that diversion, I got locked in, swinging back to the 80s on the environment pretty quickly as the core of my beat. I wrote about the space shuttle, the future of cars, all kinds of things. But in 1985 was my first climate story. It's right here still, my nuclear winter perils. And look at this, the frozen earth drama, very dramatic. And that says something about climate stories generally, which is they're sort of hard to catch people's attention with. So we tend to kind of distill down the stark side of them. And it turned out that when that story, nuclear winter, was the idea that if Russia and the United States threw enough nuclear weapons at each other, enough cities burned, that schmutz in the air would cool the climate and dangerously disrupt agriculture and ecosystems. It quickly devolved into more like nuclear autumn. Literally, there was a piece written in Foreign Affairs by two climate scientists who said, we think it's more like nuclear autumn. But where's your cover? Where's your headline in nuclear autumn, right? Nuclear winter, you're talking nuclear autumn. And the same models that were being used to assess that were also being used already in the 80s to look at global warming, which of course has been a much stickier story. And 1988 is when I wrote my first cover story on global warming. That was in Discover magazine. So that's 1988, 1985. Something about those two covers says a lot about journalism and peril. We tend to distill, we tend to find the narrative and amp it up, and the good newsrooms are the ones that test those questions. Well, how much do we know about this? How much of this is consequential? Who's at fault? We really love the conflict stories. That's why Joe Manchin gets all the press around the climate legislation these days. But is Joe Manchin really the issue? When you look at the big picture, it's more complicated. And I started to learn through that process, I wouldn't call it the limits of journalism, but just the architecture of journalism isn't always set up to really convey what is known, unknown, doable, and not doable about issues that are very consequential. I came to the New York Times in 1995 after doing a lot of that magazine work and some books. And the newsroom at a newspaper is even more distilling, more. I started thinking about what I called I didn't think about it. The newsroom language included the phrase front page thought. Where's the front page thought in that? My good friend Cornelia Dean, who was the science editor at the New York Times, what would happen every 3 p.m. or so, the front page meeting would happen. There's a front page meeting in the morning and then one in the afternoon. And in the old days when the printed paper was still the core product, those meetings were very consequential. But you go in there as a science editor, like Corey did, with some new paper, new article on sea level rise and Greenland ice. And the editors in chief, the executive editor, et cetera, they're all dealing with the stock market and the pandemic, or back then the recession or the like. And it's a competitive space. And there was a point when I stopped fighting the front page thought at the New York Times. I was happier to get a story into the science section where I would get more space, but it was a compromise because the science section of the paper was read by people already interested in science. The front page was more of a open space. Everyone in New York City getting the printed paper had a common front page. So even if you never thought about climate in your life, if you got a climate story on that front page, it would be part of that public discussion. Same thing for the nightly news and TV. And along comes the internet, which was coming in the mid to late 90s. And that concept started to dissolve. Now, it was the homepage, not the front page. And I began feeling another set of frustrations, but also opportunities. In 2003, I went to the North Pole for the New York Times. It was the first time a reporter had gone to the sea ice, floating on the Arctic Ocean, right at the North Pole, with scientists for a couple of days. And an editor back in the newsroom, Rebecca DeMolin, a web editor, she said, "Hey, let's do a reader Q&A." So it was like an AMA on Reddit, but in 2003. And while I was on the sea ice, I had my satellite phone, and she would read me the questions that were coming in, and I would recite the answers, and she would type them out. So that was our version of a Q&A. And that was really cool because I was there to report a story, but I was also conveying the process of being there, being a journalist. And I really glommed onto that. And that was sort of the seed, one of the tracks that led me to do the blog at the Times. There wasn't some editor saying, "Andy, we need to have an environment and sustainability blog." 2007, I launched .earth after several months of playing around with a blog editor, Jeremy Zallara. And I did it on top of all my other work, not because someone said that needs to be done. It's because I felt it was a better fit for the story. The story of climate is every story. It's linked to biodiversity loss. It's social story. It's about behavior and perception. It's about technology. And it's about basic climate science, what's happening with ice sheets and stuff. And the interactivity, as I said, at the North Pole, and I did the same thing in Greenland, felt like a good part of it. So jumping forward, I was at the Times for 20 years, including 6 of those were once I started teaching at Pace University. It was freelance writing. My column moved to the opinion side. But that didn't really change me very much. As Keith knows, my opinion is that reality matters. And that insulated me from the idea that I was becoming a pundit, per se, that I was there just to present opinions. My activism is around reality. But it's not a space where you're not popular with any particular faction, except a very small one, if your goal is to portray the real state of the world, because we all come to this landscape now because of the internet particularly, but not just the internet. Remember, talk radio for the right wing. And we come into this with a very culturally framed sense of what the world is and how it should be. And that, as I said way back at the beginning with my story on Paraquat, I try really hard to get outside of my own blinders, to get outside of my own tunnel vision and flip in my head, well, is this the whole story? And that's what led me ultimately to some of the stuff I've been doing lately, which has built on what I did with .earth. That blog ran for 9 years. I did 2,810 posts. There were more than 100,000 comments, probably 99% of which I vetted myself. The Times back then didn't have either automatic vetting or people doing that. But what I've been doing lately, again, is this Sustain What webcast I do through Columbia, where I've been for 2.5 years. And even the name Sustain What is designed to jog people out of the idea of using flat words that can have basically no meaning because they have so many meanings. Sustainability is one of those words. To me, climate emergency has no utility or validity unless you start to say whose emergency. what is the emergency? Who is suffering from the emergency? And then you realize a lot of that is a vulnerability emergency. It's not a climate change emergency. It's a vulnerability emergency. And I've written several pieces about that in my bulletin. The thing I just started in April last year is this, in July, is this Revkin.bulletin.com. It's a free newsletter. It's free because Facebook is paying for it. And that's a compromise because I'm working with Facebook. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be on Facebook to get the thing. It's this freestanding website. But they came to me and said, you want to be part of our inaugural cohort of people writing on this platform? They're committing a lot of money to support regional, local journalists and underserved markets and the BIPOC community, which is great. So far, they seem to really be serious about it, despite all their the terrible things that Facebook has enabled. So I guess that gets to the reality that everything is a compromise and a trade-off. Every journalism enterprise is. If I stayed at the New York Times, which I could have done, I took a buyout in 2009 at the end of the year. I could have continued on there, but the Times has some enormous problems that I think still are many of them unresolved. You see every day in the criticism of the paper. They've come a long way. They've finally gotten into all the things I was pushing them to do. So I feel like very validated. When I was doing .earth and all that stuff, it was not because the Times recognized its value. They never really pushed the blog at all. It was all my own stuff. And maybe that's a good place to pause for a minute because there's much more to go and I don't want to ramble on too far.
Can I just ask you, Andy, to sort of differentiate between what is the newsletter of the Stain What and the Revkin.bulletin? Are you covering the same topics there? Are they different newsletters?
Well, one is a webcast, which I started on March 2020 as the pandemic was unfolding. I just saw StreamYard. I thought it was Srinivasan, who used to be at Columbia. He's now got a position at Stony Brook. He's sort of a internet social media maven. He was doing a Sunday morning. Oh, there goes that camera again. A Sunday morning show using StreamYard. And I thought, well, I want to have a conversation with people as this pandemic is unfolding on these issues, and what's the best platform? And StreamYard goes live to Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn, even Twitch if I want to. If anyone there knows Twitch, let's talk Twitch because I'm trying to figure it out. At any rate, so you're engaging multiple audiences at once, and the comments and questions from all of those places come into a queue. So I could have up to, realistically, 3 or 4 people in a conversation and try to drive things forward. So that's the webcast. And when Facebook came to me, basically what I've been trying to figure out is how to replicate .earth. They call it a newsletter. I still see it as a blog. And although those are very different things, if any of you have a newsletter or if you subscribe to them, a newsletter is really different, even philosophically, than a blog. So I'm still trying to figure that out. I do have 1,300 followers from 0 a few months ago. So that's slowly building it back to what .earth was like. And they intersect. The conversations I have on the platform inform pieces that I write for the blog or for the bulletin.
The difference I see between a newsletter and what your blog was, what I loved about .earth and what I really actually loved even when I was still having a blog at Discover was a conversation. I felt like I was in conversation.
Exactly.
It wasn't a passive. I love writing and reporting stories, and but that's a passive experience, or it's just me putting out a product and then that's it. It's one and done, and then maybe on social media you can talk about it. But I really loved when I was blogging, and I love that about .earth because you had such engaging, thoughtful conversation in the threads, not just in your post, but actually in the comment section.
Well, and then I would elevate them. Actually,
Right.
today, if I have time today, I'm trying to let's go back to Colorado. In 1 month ago exactly, I did 2 pieces on the fires there, and a comment came in on this one that was spectacular and relates to what we're talking about here. Let me see if I can find it. I think it was. Oh yeah, here we go. JLK. Whoops, wrong button. Let me just show you this. She says, so I wrote this whole piece on essentially what we saw in Colorado wasn't a wildfire. There was a grassland fire that was a wildfire, certainly started by some human factor that's still being figured out. And I did a piece on these homes that didn't burn down. And via social media, via Twitter, I got a hold of a guy who lived in one of these homes, and I did a live interview with him on Sustain What on the webcast. And he said some really interesting things about, here's another home that didn't burn down, surrounded by homes that did. And there's lots of lessons there. These are urban fires. They're not, it was an urban firestorm. Oh yeah, here was his tweet. We live in a new build house in Superior. All 27 homes built the same way survived while everything else around us burned down. So we did a conversation, which is right here. He did a walk around, like it was a live walk around in his neighborhood. But let's get back to the comment. So this comment comes in from a woman. Whoops, sorry. Scrolling. I just was there a minute ago. Hold on.
That's all right. But that's what Andy would do at .org. He'd get a great comment that would elevate or advance the conversation, the story, and then he'd put it or he'd either put it in the existing blog post, or he would use that as a springboard into a new blog post. So I saw what he was doing, and I did the same thing.
Yeah. So let me just read this one to you. Anyone who's a journalist who's done parachute journalism after a disaster, whether it's virtual like I did here or on the ground, you tend to focus on victims, or maybe in this case, what didn't burn. But here's a victim. She's been in touch with me since then. My family's house in the Rock Creek neighborhood of Superior burned to the ground. Their immediate neighbor lost his home as well, but the house directly on the other side was absolutely fine. My dad, by the way, who turns out to be a climate scientist, will now be spending the next who knows how long figuring out how exactly one goes about rebuilding a house that's been destroyed by a fire. And here we go to the really powerful part. I read this article wanting to be angry and to accuse you of victim blaming. But the anger never fully manifested. I'm devastated by all this and heartbroken that there were measures that might have been taken on a larger scale to have prevented this loss. At the same time, however, I'm also extremely grateful to be able to send this information to my dad for when it's time to build a new home on the property. I mean, I was so moved by this, both for reminding me that, these are real situations. These are not just data, that these houses, and this is a very privileged neighborhood. These are people who really, have a privileged disaster. They have insurance and can rebuild. I also wrote a month earlier about the tornadoes in the Southeast, and there you have a horrific situation in which already feedback has been beneficial to me in driving the story forward. But this one, I said, dear JL, I'm really deeply sorry for the losses your family and so many neighbors have suffered. Having covered disasters for a long time, I've always been reluctant to write too much too soon about sources of vulnerability and safer design, in other words, solutions. In this case, because so many other communities face the same mix of hazard and risk factors up and down the foothills and elsewhere in the West, I felt it's important to start this discussion. This is a constant stress for, when's the right time to write the right story? When is it ever too soon to write a solution story? Well, you can write it when no one's paying attention, which is after the disaster, or you can dive in while things are still, recovery is still happening. And there's no easy answer there. But it was fantastic to hear from her. And I felt a sense of success, because if I'd been like I don't want to say typical journalist, if my focus had not been solutions, her victim blaming, would have been legitimate. And she felt something about the way I wrote the story helped to her find the solution part in it too. And that's just what Keith was saying. This is different than much traditional journalism where you just go on and, do thank you very much when there's reader engagement. It's different than actually really drawing on that engagement. If I had, from just talking, my blog was only about fires, I would already have posted this and started a discussion on these journalistic frame questions. When's the right time to write a story? I'm trying to do that today because I finally got caught up a little bit. So that's the dynamic that, as Keith was saying, I really cherish that more than other things. And here's a piece just to, I've written a lot about endangered species too, and we're down to the last 7 or 8 vaquitas. These are the world's tiniest porpoise. They live in a small chunk of Mexican waters, and they're doomed. If Mexico doesn't get serious about protecting this little patch of water, which is totally predictable. And so I just paid a freelance translator to translate it into Spanish. So, because if there's any chance of my story having impact, it's not going to be from writing for my conventional English language audience, which I did write in. This was the piece I did in December. And so, who is the right audience for the right story is also important to think about too.
Yeah, that's really important. That's something we're going to be talking about throughout the semester. Hey, Andy, I'm going to open it up to the students in a second, but
sure.
I want to ask you one question first. That is something you've talked about over the years. It's been a while, perhaps, since you've talked about it. And I was reminded of it when I read this article in CJR, the Columbia Journalism Review, I think a year ago. And it was titled, I believe, Tyranny of the News Peg. And there was a great quote. I remembered you. He actually quoted you. I can't remember who the author is of that CJR piece, but he did mention you, and he was talking about sort of, it was just the whole idea of like, hey, we journalists need to be reminded that we just can't just become hostage all the time to these new, especially in the 24-hour news environment. Yeah. And I wonder if you could talk about that, because I'm in a tough situation here. We're talking. The students are going to be learning about, how to find the right pegs and angles for their stories. So on the one hand, they need to have news pegs. They need to have topical pegs for their stories for editors to pay attention and to grab the attention of readers. But at the same time, I don't want it to be the be and end all of a story and to drive it. So how do we find that balance?
Yeah, well, I found the balance. Here's the piece. If any of you are on, I do think Twitter is still really useful. It was John Alsop, I guess, who wrote this piece. Did a string on Twitter about the peg. Yeah. As I was just saying a minute ago, with when's the right time for the right story, public attention is like I guess it's the opposite of a beam of light. It's a sucking process. People go out thinking about fire or thinking about race, after George Floyd. So there is an opportunity to hook onto that, to hang your story on the peg, meaning what's the hook? The question is, what are you doing around it? I think more. It's absolutely a legitimate and real part of the landscape of how ideas and solutions and problems are conveyed in society. Tornadoes are not in the news right now. I could write a really good piece on my tornado reporting and post it tomorrow, and it'll get 50 views. So that's where I think, as you go forward through the semester, you might think about whether it's social media or a blogish format or a podcast, something where you're sort of articulating your journey while you're working on the bigger pieces, can make the most of the news peg, but also sort of embed that in a larger landscape that ideas, people with ideas or arguments can latch onto. So they know you are a person who is seriously engaged with urban flooding, like the flash flooding that devastated big chunks of the boroughs last year. And you're not there just when the floodwaters are rising. So I think that's why I still like the .earth form I did. What I haven't done lately, I guess now with the Sustain What Bulletin, it's a place for me to distill some of the learning I'm doing through these conversations. I really don't have the capacity to do nearly enough distillation of what I'm learning. I don't have a newsroom. It's just me. So that's one of those compromises I made when I left the staff of a bigger publication. Although there too, I was pretty much sort of free-ranging. So I guess news pegs are fine. The more you're prepared and have context sort of aligned and a conversation going before the peg, the better. And I think that's a good way to go.
It's good advice. Okay, so hey, I want you guys to weigh in and ask Andy any questions or make any comments. So I'd like to open it up. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Ethan. We read your piece about reporting on global warming for 18 years, where you sort of talked about the necessity of a diversity of strategies when it comes to like action and communication for these subjects. But I feel like there's an issue in a lot of sort of journalism in this sort of beat where pieces that include a lot of statistics, a lot of data, they sort of like, a lot of people say their eyes kind of glaze over when they read it, or they can't, fully pay attention, or it loses them. Then on the flip side, you have pieces that, don't necessarily include, those very granular details. And, a lot of critics will say, well, where's your evidence? Like where, what sort of substantiates this piece? And I was just wondering if you feel like there's, a specific sort of balancing act you can strike, or like how you can reconcile those two things to make the piece as effective as possible.
That's a core responsibility and opportunity. Always, every good feature story you see is a balance of data and anecdote. Anecdote essentially being narrative. And I think data can do more. There's ways to make data captivating and propelling and a propellant for action. Probably not so much within the context of an article, though. The piece I just did over the weekend on energy. How do you decarbonize 93 million houses? There's no single narrative. I live in the Hudson Valley, where most houses are still being heated with oil. My friends out in the Southwest are, houses are mostly cooled with electricity, and it's where what kind of power plant you have that determines your carbon footprint, not so much what your house is like. So there's no single narrative for that, but that's where data, I think, can really come in. I'm just going to show you something in that piece I did yesterday at revkin.bulletin.com. I pointed to this website in Canada called myheat.ca, which is using data. Here, this is data on its aerial surveys showing heat loss in houses using infrared cameras, and boy, it says lots. So this is Edmonton. When you're zooming in on, you can already see heat loss is red. And so if you're in a neighborhood there, you can think, wow, my neighbors all are like shifting to more insulated homes. Mine isn't. Or you could see, wow, these low income neighborhoods are really, they're losing money and energy at the same time. And that's very powerful to me. And, then you talk to social scientists about how the way you design your electric bill can actually change behavior or not, depending on the design of the bill. So I kind of see that as a frontier for journalism. How do you integrate that into a story? And there have been some really good examples. Nadia Popovich and Brad Plumer at the New York Times did a really good piece on redlining, racist history of neighborhood real estate policies and how that relates to heat. And they did just what you were talking about. They had a meshwork of anecdote and data from different cities around the country showing how poverty and blackness map with heat exposure. And it was all built on 2 or 3 papers. So research, basic social geography, other research was the underpinning of the story, but they turned it into a good product. It's doable.
Just a reminder, Brad Plumer is going to be one of our guests in a few weeks.
Oh, good. You should have him talk through that story.
Yeah, definitely. Brad also has a really interesting journey. I made sure to include that in the syllabus, articles that he's written from way back from when he started at, I think at the New Republic or even before that, just so you could chart his journey as a journalist. And we can talk to him about that. But I'll definitely, if I hadn't put this story on, I'll make sure we link up to the one that Andy's mentioning. Okay, great. Other questions? Yes.
Hello, this is Jeannie. I'm interested in sustainable buildings, and like you've been describing, I noticed that your latest piece was about retrofitting American homes to make them more energy efficient. And I was wondering if you think this infrastructure challenge is existent in commercial buildings, and specifically how is this problem of sustainability being mirrored in New York City buildings?
Oh, yeah. I did a conversation, I think it might be online, with a guy from Metropolis magazine, the editor, on commercial buildings and decarbonization. And he made some really powerful points. I should put you in touch with him. It might take too long for me to fish back for it. He was saying we think about buildings as a static entity, and he said what the real problem with commercial buildings is that every 3 or 4 or 5 years, there's a total makeover of a floor as a new client comes in, a new tenant comes in. And his whole thing was a manifesto on how to look at the full life cycle of the building, including the dynamics of that building, pieces coming and going, new furniture coming in and out. And he'd be a great source for you for that question. He's trying to generate a new understanding among the building management to look at carbon in that way as well.
So Andy, I'll follow up with you offline about that. Okay.
Yep. No, it's a good story.
Other questions? Yes.
You seem to get a lot of engagement with your webcast and you did on your blog, which is helping you get these really exciting, fruitful stories and conversations. How do you go about facilitating that engagement when you've moved yourself away from a mainstream publication? How do you get people interested in the more niche news mediums?
Good question.
What was the last how do I get people interested in what the last?
And the more niche news mediums, like the Times, the Patriot, is really mainstream. Lots of people see that. Yeah. How do you get people to pay attention to something different?
It's not very easy. As I said, I did all that blogging in the New York Times, and when I started this new thing, I'm starting from scratch because, among other things, the Times never developed an email sign up for .earth, which I thought I kept badgering them for years. Can we have people have the option of getting this in their inbox when I do a new piece? Now, of course, newsletters are all the rage. So I think what you have to think about with these niches, whether it is a newsletter you want to build or a blog, is patience. You have to have patience, and you have to engage with people. If you reach out to people whose thinking and actions you value related to whatever your quest is, do a Q&A with them, get them onto your platform, and that can then reverberate outward and build a little bit more visibility for what you're doing, even if it might be a niche. And it's getting to be years now, so maybe this isn't such a valid example, but Brian Stelter, who's the CNN media analyst, started out as Brian Stelter, a college kid.
Yep.
Doing really engaging journalism on, I think, sports initially, and what's his name? There are other examples like that. So
yeah, Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Are you sure it was sports? I thought it was media. I thought he was.
Was it
or
media
some-
from the beginning? I'd have to look back.
Yeah.
But he was really he was himself, and then he, that engaged and built, and he ended up bringing him to CNN.
But on that point about how do you do it, I mean, I really miss .earth, and I don't know if there's a conflict of interest and whether you can speak to this, but is there a way for you, like if I was an editor at the Atlantic or somebody, I would want to resuscitate it and see it, get it more, get a larger profile. I mean, I know you have a perch at the Columbia School there, and that's a great perch, but as you said before, I do sort of feel like what you're doing is speaking to the choir and not getting out to a lot.
Yeah.
I could be wrong about that, but
no.
I want to see it out to a larger audience.
Yeah, no, I talked to the Atlantic at one point.
Okay,
Before the Facebook thing happened.
sure.
I was exploring a .earth-ish thing here and there and everywhere, but there's a lot of stuff that is sort of like that now. That's here, there, and everywhere. It's not the same, one thing I'll tell you that I think has been lost in recent years among that entire group of people looking at sustainability questions. 10 years ago, David Roberts and I, and even Joe Rahm, who was very critical of me, had sort of an activist liberal blog we would engage with each other. You would write a piece and link out to someone else's work and discuss it. That happens on Twitter to some extent, but you rarely see that in writing anymore. Some of this is actually because of platform policies. There are platforms that don't want their writers to link out to work outside of the domain because you're taking away readers from staying on site. The whole thing is about keeping people on site and engaged. And I think journalism suffers as a result. We all end up more compartmentalized. Brad Plumer would agree on this because he and I used to link out to his stuff a lot when he was in his various incarnations earlier. And I think that's a shame. These issues, especially climate, are so multidimensional that there's no one owns that story. The story lies in between and among all these different vantage points. And if our ecosystem of communication options is not sort of reflecting that, then we're right back where. Well, I'll just say, like, there was a tweet this morning from a super smart guy on energy, Jesse Jenkins at
Jesse's good.
At Princeton now, who said something really valuable, and it started a discussion on Twitter. This is relevant, so hold on just 1 second. Let me show it.
I do think, and I'll sort of, while you're finding that, fill in. I do worry, though. It's so ephemeral that, I mean, I used to worry about that with blogs, how like, it's, we have this great conversation for a few days, because we would have a conversation. I agree with you that we would all play off of each other and advance the conversation that way. And I thought often a fruitful manner. But now, and it happens, as you said, on Twitter, but it's really in a much more rapid, way. I mean, you could have a good Twitter thread and have a conversation that springboards off of that. Yeah. But then you're really on to the next one, 20 minutes later, or right. 24 hours later.
Well, yeah, and the most fundamental shift, and I don't want to discourage you from the long form writing you'll be doing the next couple of months. My shift over the last, if you build my career into 3 decades, the first decade was definitely like this kind of thing, printed output, very unidirectional. And then came the .earth mashup middle.
This was the second phase, New York Times?
Well, the middle phase is sort of 2005 through 2015, when I was blogging and writing pieces. And then the current me is less about me than about facilitating conversations, introducing people to each other through those webcasts I've done. I've done like 230 of them, and maybe 250. And they've introduced people to other people from different sectors who never would cross otherwise. An anthropologist and a climate scientist, or a futurist in Nairobi, and Joel Cohen, who's a population expert at Rockefeller in Columbia, who are he's on a very rarefied level looking at population. And Katindi, I can't remember her last name right now. I met her online through another conversation. She's trying to develop a futures lab for kids in Kenya to get beyond living in the now. If you're poor and struggling, you're just a now person, right? How do Kenyans build enough capacity to have foresight and think about long-term planning, conservation, climate, resilience? And Joel Cohen and Katindi never would have met. And they might, I'm not sure if they're going to collaborate on a paper going forward or something, but little bits of each of them is now rubbed off on the other. And I think of each one of those moments as a success. I cannot point to the outcome. I've done sessions where students have engaged with Herman Daly, Herman Daly, the founder of ecological economics. I had on Noam Chomsky recently with some students, and for them and for him, there was great things that came out of that. That will reverberate forward in a way that I know is not making the world worse, but is not necessarily positive and impactful in a way that I can point to some funder and say, hey, look what I just did. We just did a session with an Arctic community, Arctic indigenous community, and some climate scientists who the Moore Foundation funded. And just keep this in your head. This is a lot of steps away from what you're working on right now. But the Moore Foundation is a huge enterprise. They give money for all kinds of things. And 5 years ago, they gave $3.7 million to Columbia and University of Alaska and this indigenous community, not to solve a problem, but to work together to understand sea ice and how it relates to seals and seal hunting. And it was like so refreshing to see that, because way too much of what we do, whether it's in a newsroom or in philanthropy, has some pre-imagined outcome in mind. NSF grants are, what's the expected, how do you measure and evaluate things? And many of the issues you'll deal with related to sustainability have timescales or complexities that will never permit or include the possibility of measurement and evaluation. And that, that isn't going to help you in the job market right now, but hopefully it'll help you frame how you approach whatever job you get coming out of NYU going forward. So you have that, and you're thinking in that open way. You're not getting too truncated or blinded by the expectations around you, or you use the tools you have independent of the job you have been given to pursue that broader thing. This came up, 2 years ago or so, conversation with a journalism student. I can't remember, was it email or what? Upstate New York somewhere. And I said, well, just do the job, but then use the social media component to take it further. Even if it's not part of your job per se, you make that the inquiry-based part of your journalism, and you can stay sane and feel like you're on a trajectory that matters.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I think you kind of touched on it on the last question a little bit, but now that we're about to start publishing and writing stories about specific topics, I wonder if you've seen any common mistakes that journalists make when covering environmentalism, and then anything that you think maybe gets a little bit too much attention and it's not really warranted, topics that are kind of talked about or covered too frequently.
Can you repeat that, Keith, or somebody?
Yeah, I had a hard time. Maybe just if you want to pull it down for a second, just to be clear. Go ahead. Just a little bit. Go ahead.
Just any mistakes that you see in covering the specific field kind of commonly, and then people get too much attention that you really want to.
I heard the first part best, the mistakes. Well, one of them is one I made. And I think is made routinely still. I mixed up climate change and climate risk. And like, if there's one thing that exposes a huge number of story possibilities, it's flipping in your head from the frame that everyone is coming at the current moment with, which is climate change, meaning the climate crisis is about a change in the climate. That's part of it. But the much bigger component of what's actually happening or not happening in communities or systems in harm's way is a function of vulnerability and exposure. Because there's this formula, risk managers all have this like formula in their heads. Risk, which is the thing we want to reduce, right, is a function of the hazard, which can be wildfire, flood, sea level rise, insects, whatever. So hazard times exposure, how many people or how much stuff is in the way, and as a function of vulnerability. Meaning if you're growing your crop in an air-conditioned greenhouse, global warming doesn't really matter. If you're growing your crop in a field with variable weather, blah, 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 it matters. So we could have lower climate risk in a changing climate for sure. Climate change isn't actually affecting risk on the ground nearly as much as these other factors so far, almost everywhere. And this people find that hard to believe, but it's true. It's in the data that there's an expanding bullseye we have built of vulnerability and exposure that's been expanding way faster than climate is changing. So climate risk, just taking that one thing, saying, my editor wants me to write about climate change, but what's actually in front of me? Why did some houses in Superior, Colorado burn and some didn't? Why did the Amazon warehouse in Edwardsville, Illinois, kill 8 people? I think it's 8. When in 2004, a similarly sized structure hit by a more powerful tornado, not far away, killed none of the 150 workers inside because the owner invested in tornado shelters in another part of Illinois. And so the story isn't about, we could write 10 stories about, is climate change affecting tornadoes? Yeah, maybe sort of, they're moving a little bit. But the story is why the F did the richest company in the history of companies, building warehouses all through Tornado Alley, not look at the history of big buildings in Tornado Alley. And that's a huge story that's still not adequately told right now. I haven't had time to circle back to it, so someone is free to go and find that story. They're building these big box targets, literally, throughout an area historically vulnerable to devastating tornadoes. And that story is not about one warehouse, it's about the system. And so that's shows you the power of flipping things around from climate change to climate risk. We're surrounded by opportunities.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Did he answer? Was there another aspect to your question?
I missed, and I didn't quite hear the last part.
Just if there's anything that gets too much coverage that is kind of done.
Is there anything that's over reported? Are we beating something to death? In the environmental realm, a story.
Well, it's a good question. I think there's a different way of framing it. Perhaps we could say, are we not telling certain aspects of the climate story correctly? Meaning that when we conclude through 40 or 50 years that energy demands of society dominate climate concerns, is it useful to keep writing stories saying climate policy is failing, climate policy is failing, climate policy is failing? Or is there a new way to look at that? I think that's almost like a homework assignment. What is the different frame there, or what's the real story there?
Isn't this what, wasn't this part of the controversy some years ago, and maybe to some extent still is, with organizations like the Breakthrough and some of the advocates for nuclear energy? I remember I was a little bit sort of on the periphery of some of those debates. I think you were more central to them than me, but there was a focus at one point about, how do we shift the conversation to energy and not climate? But there was a lot of pushback, keep it front and center on climate and not talk about, nuclear power, partly because of, some of the, inherent biases there. But and maybe you could speak to that. Maybe you could speak to journalists. You and I have been caught up in that. When there is not just contentious science, but a lot of conflict over policy prescriptions. You can get caught up in that. It's like a minefield. I remember, always feeling like I was navigating through a minefield with some of these issues by trying to do that, by trying to reframe the issue.
Oh, sure. And this is a desperate fight. He who controls. You're reminding me of a geographer I quoted once who said the side with the best map wins. That I wrote about the Dakota pipeline. There was some interesting mapping going on. The side with that has the narrative wins in our society, because the media follow that narrative, the political rhetoric. So it's a life or death fight for things that I never used to think of as a journalist. I hated the word framing, and now I really understand how important framing is. And there's a desperate fight to control the frame. So if you're a renewable energy activist, or if you're a funder of the Energy Foundation, which gets hundreds of millions of dollars spent on a renewable-only future, you really want that narrative to win, and you tamp down ferociously a narrative that conflicts with that. I think it's very damaging for us to think that there's one frame, because the developing world, for example, countries that haven't used their carbon yet, this came out of COP26, so I wrote a piece about they're to tell African nations, because John Kerry and the United States and others in Europe are pursuing a kind of a high-level climate goal, that we should no longer help finance development of fossil fuels in Ghana or Nigeria. They see that as a fundamental ethical issue. It's a form of climate injustice. We talk about climate justice, but that climate justice doesn't include energy justice, and those. So I guess I would say again, if you want to be true to the realities in the world, understanding that response diversity, meaning having a diverse array of responses around the world, like I said in that article you guys read, is not only inevitable, it's desirable on a complex planet. That means you'll be attacked. There'll be attempts to marginalize you, but ultimately, we all make choices. I've chosen to be in a camp that's smaller than Bill McKibben's, or who's a friend. He's very much in one frame. And Michael Schellenberger, I don't want to be in his camp either. He's a chiding, sort of. He's trying to fight a battle based on logic alone, which never will work too, because the social science says that we'll never perceive these issues through one filter either, not just frames, but filters. So it's complicated, it's hard. I think there are ways to do this. You can get out in the world, dig in on a local story. The more you can do locally, by the way, and getting away from the global frames, the better, because I think after looking at these global issues for so many years, half of my life, dare I say I'm 65. I wrote this halfway through my life. there's not a lot you can do at the global level. The top-down stuff, the climate talks and the UN treaty. One of my other big learnings was that treaties mostly memorialize what's already possible. They don't drive what happens. They memorialize what countries have already decided they can do realistically at home. So that takes us back home. Well, what can you do? You got to consider the global level, but it's policy, community, and personal levels matter more than people like to say these days. And that, like taking it back to that My Heat map, that's a function of using communication innovation to map personal decisions, to enable grander policy to reflect change in these global, on the global level. So thinking about what you can do there in the city, whatever your beat is, whatever the issue is, how does that relate to somewhere else? But keep an eye on how people behave locally, and you'll see lots more possibilities and lots fewer of these kind of grand pissing matches.
Well, that's a great place to end. Unless somebody has another question they want to, I'm happy to. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Can we take another 5 or 10 minutes, Andy?
Yeah, I think I have a meeting. Let me just double check if I have a meeting that's starting right now. Hold on, or is it 12:30?
Maybe we could squeeze in one last question.
Yeah, try to do one more question.
Okay,
And I can also reply offline, and we can keep this going.
great.
It's just a quick career question. At what point after graduating college did you feel grounded or like professionally secure as a journalist? What did you do to get there? And at any point after feeling that way, did you have moments of like feeling like you lost it?
Good.
Well, for one thing, I didn't get into journalism until I was 5 years out of college. 4, I guess. And I had the privilege of, I got a grant when I graduated from Brown to go study pursue a project in the South Pacific. And I ended up on a sailboat, all kinds of journeys in places that then turned me to wanting to be a journalist. Once I was also privileged, in the 1980s, early 80s, journalism was still a thriving, traditional sort of elevator kind of place. My first job was as assistant copy editor at Science Digest. And the editor was enterprising enough that he let us do some writing, and I became a senior editor there. So that was a very traditional way to work your way forward. And you face a different landscape now. There are ways to pursue a career. If always keeping, I think, tune your career choices to what drives you, what wakes you up in the morning, or keeps you up late at night on an issue. And like when I was blogging, Keith probably feels the same way. It's because I can't not do it. And so that form was really driving me forward. Writing, I've tweeted this more than once. I hate writing. Writing is really hard and torturous. And then you have this momentary relief when it's published. And now, of course, it's like selling the article once it's published is another part of the work. So find something that fits what drives you personally, and you can go forward. When I taught at Pace University, a course called Blogging a Better Planet, it was for master's students in communication. It was not a journalism course. And my Better Planet definition was wide and deep. It was sort of whatever hooked create a blog, either you or individually, or you and 2 or 3 people, around something you're already passionate about. And then it's really kind of self-propelling, and you can find ways to finance it. I think ultimately it'll always be a different model than the one I grew up with and Professor Kluwer grew up with. But one thing that I've learned, whether it's climate, hydrology, conservation, journalism, there's a word that's stationarity, which is that most of our institutions are built around some pre-existing notion of a baseline and norms. That's all gone. We're so far stationary. Google for the phrase stationarity is dead.
Yeah,
and you'll find some interesting which is exciting and at the same time, can be exhausting sometimes when you realize the norm is change. And that means agility, plasticity are really important too. But I'll just circle back one more time to the things that engage you. Oh, and I will say, the one thing which I don't really have right now is community. Try to build your own little team, whether it's a team of practitioners, someone to do the visual part, someone to do the social media part. Try to find, the more you have a collaborative community, the better off you'll be in terms of sanity and probably viability too.